Okay, well, welcome to Wine and Wisdom for this week, Parshat Re'eh. This week, Parshat Re'eh, we read, yes, as always, we'll start with a little Parsha overview. We'll discuss the Parsha for just a moment. Then we'll dive into a life lesson that we can learn from the Parsha. This week will be a lesson on tzedakah. It's called the gift of dignity. Given with a smile is worth everything. This week's Torah portion starts off where Moshe Rabbeinu is continuing to talk to the Jewish people. Moses, our fearless leader, is about to die, and the Jewish people are going to enter the land of Israel. And the last book of the Torah of the 5 books of Moses ends off with Moses speaking to the Jewish people with his last kind of will and testament, his instructions to them as they're going to go forward in their journeys, etc. In this week's Parsha, he says, Re'eh, see, I place before you today a blessing and a curse. I put before you a bracha, which is a blessing, and klala, which is a curse. Why is he putting before them a blessing and a curse? He says, listen, if you follow the ways of Hashem, then you'll be blessed. If you don't, then you'll be cursed. And then he ends off and he says, choose life. All right, fair enough. And then he starts to get into some of the different mitzvot. He talks about the different mitzvot that happen when a temple is established in the name of Hashem, and there's karbanos that are going to be brought, there are sacrifices that will be brought. And he talks about prophets and false prophets, and he talks about what happens when somebody entices other people to worship idols, right? So unfortunately, this was fairly common in those days. Idol worship was a big challenge. And so I guess nobility who would try to convince others to also serve idol worship was an issue. There is the mitzvah of meiser in this week's Torah portion, which is the mitzvah of tithing, giving 10% of all your earnings. 10% of the produce at that time that had to be eaten in Jerusalem. There are certain years when instead of the tithing going to Jerusalem and eating it in Jerusalem, the tithing would happen. The tithing would happen in your own city, and you would give it to the poor people. There's also Meiser Behema, which is a portion of your animals that have to be given to the Kohen. And then we get to the mitzvah of tzedakah, the famous mitzvah of tzedakah, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And specifically, we're warned that on the 7th year, on the year of Shemitah, when we're not supposed to work the land, the sabbatical year that is, so tells us the Torah that one of the first things you're going to think, I'm going to cut corners because I'm going to want to survive this 7th year when I can't work the land. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back on my giving. Says the Torah, that's not the thing to do. And the Parsha ends off with the 3 pilgrimage holidays, the laws of the 3 pilgrimage holidays, Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, and the Sukkot. And there's a mitzvah for every single Jew to go and be seen, to see and be seen before Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash. So that is this week's Torah portion in a nutshell. And this week, I want to start off by telling you what we're going to talk about, which is this week we're going to talk about the mitzvah of tzedakah. And hold on just one second. And we are going to talk about the mitzvah of tzedakah specifically, not so much in the details as to how exactly to give tzedakah, but we're going to talk about tzedakah in terms of what about the feeling behind tzedakah, okay? So let me ask you guys a question as we start off before we dive right into it. In your understanding of the mitzvah of tzedakah, so tzedakah means to give charity, to give to those in need, etc. In your understanding of the mitzvah of tzedakah, let's start with Stephanie. Does it make a difference what I'm thinking? I see someone and they are in need of whatever it is, whether it's food, clothing, whatever it is. I give it to them. Does it make a difference how I feel or what I'm thinking while I'm doing the mitzvah, or is it all about my giving? What do you think, Stephanie?
I think it's all about, no, it's not all about the giving. That's for sure.
Okay. So you're saying the feeling does matter. What you're feeling and what you're thinking as you're doing it also matters.
It's not important as it's not. Yes.
But it is important. All right, Marilyn, what do you got? What do you think of this this topic? Oh, we can't hear you.
I think the most important thing is that the tzedakah is given, but to give it with a smile is the best because it makes the person, they don't feel like you're giving something in a begrudging way, that you see them as a human being.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's a very interesting perspective. I will share with you, first of all, welcome, Ron.
Good morning. Good evening. How are you?
Good evening. Good to see you, or good to hear you. Let me share with you, Marilyn, and really everyone here, a little experiment that I did today on Facebook, okay? I'll pull on my phone. We'll find the exact, if anyone's on Facebook, I'm sure you guys were part of this. I know we're live on Facebook now, so if anybody sees their, if anybody was part of this conversation, they'll recognize this. So I posted today on Facebook as follows. I wrote, finish this sentence. Here it is. Charity is best when it is done with. I'll share with you some of the things that I got on Facebook. But first, let me hear from you guys. Ron, you were saying something?
Anonymity.
Anonymity. Very good answer. Charity is best when it is done with anonymity. Okay, Marilyn, what would you say to that? So you said a smile, correct?
Well, I would agree, but under circumstances like on the screen, he can't really give it in an anonymous way. He's giving it,
right.
You know, he's.
Yeah, exactly. You're there. So then what you can do is give it with a smile.
Yes, but
okay.
it is really the best charity to give it without.
It's anonymous.
Congratulations. The person doesn't know who it's coming from.
So then there's no ego boost, right? Sharon, what are you? I think you were trying to share. Go ahead.
Hi.
What do you think?
I'm thinking that there's a problem in our culture.
Okay.
That a lot of people feel like they shouldn't do. They feel like it's insincere. They shouldn't give if they're not in the mood.
Okay.
And my understanding of Judaism, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that we are commanded to bring goodness into the world, whether we're in the mood or not. That we don't wait to be in a mood to be charitable or gracious or kind.
Right. So that's what Stephanie was saying. In other words, it's the action that counts. Even if you're not in the mood, at least you're giving.
Right.
Right.
And I think it's really a big part of what's wrong in our culture.
Right. Okay. Listen, the challenge on Facebook was to try to do one word. Not everybody stuck with the rules here. So charity is best when it is done with. So here's a couple answers that we got. Heart. Charity is best when it is done with heart. Charity is best when it is done with Chabad. I agree with that one. That was a good one. Here's another good one that got 4 likes. Charity is best when it is done with no expectation of reward or recognition. I like that one. Charity is best when it is done with joy. Here's another joke. Charity is done when it is done in US dollars and in cash.
until we still have US dollars. Okay.
Right, exactly. Charity is done when it is done with anonymity. Ron, that wasn't you. That was someone else. Charity is best when it is done with love and a smile, with dignity, with a camera shoved in the face of the recipient. I think that might be tongue-in-cheek. Okay. Charity is done when is best when it is done from the heart. That's another from the heart. Here's another anonymity. Another one with a smile. Marilyn, there you are. Another one for love. And some people are saying who we should be giving charity to. Anyways, that's going to be the topic of today's conversation. And the reason that that's going to be the topic of today's conversation is because this is the week, in this week's Torah portion, we get the official mitzvah of tzedakah. Now, let me just qualify that, okay? So the mitzvah of tzedakah is actually a combination of many mitzvot. When we say tzedakah, which means righteousness or justice or charity or giving to other people, etc., there's many ways in the Torah. There's probably like 10, 15 mitzvot, maybe 20 of the 613 mitzvot have to do with what we'll call kindness towards others. Like there's a separate mitzvah for hosting guests. There's a separate mitzvah for visiting the sick. There's a separate mitzvah for giving a loan to someone who needs a loan. There's a separate mitzvah for giving actual charity. There's a separate mitzvah for leaving certain types of charity, like sections of your field for charity or sections of your income to charity, etc. Lots of different mitzvahs. Tithing, many of you have heard of, etc. But in this week's Torah portion, in text 1, we get really the official mitzvah of tzedakah. Interestingly enough, it comes both in the form of a positive commandment and a negative commandment. And the Torah warns us, I should say, against letting go of our charity or stopping to give or giving less because of the 7th year of Shemitah. Okay? So why don't we start with Stephanie? You want to read for us text 1? This is from this week's Torah portion.
Okay. If there will be among you a needy person from one of your brothers in one of your cities in your land, the Lord your God is giving you, you should not harden your hearts, and you shall not choose your hand from your needy brother. Rather, you shall open your hand to him, and you shall lend him sufficient for his needs, which he is lacking. Beware lest there be in your heart an unfaithful thought, saying, the 7th year, the year of the release, has approached, and he will beguile your needy brother and not give him, begrudging your needy brother and not give him. And he will cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin to you.
So for those of you that are not familiar, in the agricultural system back in really in ancient Israel, but even in Israel today, there is a system where every 7th year we are to leave the land be. We don't eat the produce of the land, and that is because it's supposed to be left to the poor people. Now, without getting into all the details of that, suppose that you are a wheat mogul, a grain mogul, or what have you. Hold on, let me just plug this in. And you make your full living off the very fact that you actually every year reap the grains and you sell them or you use them or you make something with them or whatever it is, right? Now comes a year and you know there's a year coming when you're not going to be having any income. Even though the Torah promises you that you're going to make your income, etc. Now look, we're all human beings. And says the Torah, it's possible that you might think to yourself, let me cut some corners. And one of the corners that I'm going to cut is giving tzedakah, giving to those in need. Says the Torah, don't you dare. And we get a positive mitzvah and a negative mitzvah. You must open and you should not close your hands from those in need. From here we get the mitzvah of tzedakah. Now, mind you, this is not where the mitzvah of tzedakah ends. As we said, there are many other mitzvot in the Torah which can be categorized also as charity. And then obviously from then on in the Talmud, right? Later on in the oral Torah, in the Talmud, in the Medrash, etc., we're going to see over and over again where the virtues of charity are espoused. So let's just do a couple of them really quickly. These are just sages from throughout Jewish history that are sharing with us how important giving charity is. Marilyn, you want to share with us text 2? This is from the Talmud.
Rabbi Isaac further said, 4 things can cancel a man's fate, namely charity, supplication, change of name, and change of conduct. Charity as it is written, and charity delivers from death.
Thank you, Marilyn. So let's say you're someone who's going through something really rough, and you can't help but think in your head, oh my God, there must be some sort of decree in heaven against me, and I'm suffering through it now, and I wish I could do something to revert it. Tells us the Talmud there are 4 things you can do, okay? You can change, I want to do them in order, 1 second. 4 things cancel a man's faith, namely charity, so you can give tzedakah, that can literally make you go 180 in the other direction. Supplication, of course, prayer. Change of name, you may have seen this one, right? So you may have heard of people that are very, very sick. They have a name added to their name. So let's say their name is Reuven, and then they add to their name Reuven Chaim, which means Reuven who has life, or Reuven Raphael, which means Reuven who has healing, and things like that. And there are female equivalents as well. And then, of course, change of conduct, which is teshuvah, right? Returning to Hashem and doing more mitzvot, etc. So tzedakah is up there, that if you give more tzedakah, that can literally change your fate. Text 3 is also from the Talmud. Arnold, you want to share with us?
Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, he who does charity habitually and will have sons wise, wealthy, and verses in the Agada. Wise as it is written, he shall find life. Wealthy as it is written, he shall find righteousness. Verses in the Agada. As it is written, and he shall find honor, as it is written elsewhere, the wise shall inherit honor. Okay, so he brings 4 different verses. 3 different verses. Well,
it's actually all part of one verse that he brings, and that he just translates and explains all of these amazing things that will happen to someone. He will have children that are wise, that are wealthy, right, etc. But notice what he says, right? So he adds an extra element. He says it's not just someone who gives charity, it's someone who gives charity habitually, okay, which means they made a practice out of it. Okay, fine. In text 4, we get a little more. Where are we holding here? Ron, you want to read for us? Text 4.
It has been taught, Rabbi Yehuda says, great is charity in that it brings the redemption nearer. As it says, so says God, keep judgment and do righteousness. Tzedakah. For my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed.
Thank you. So it turns out that tzedakah, charity, is very, very powerful. Not only can it help to bring your own personal redemption from some terrible fate you might be going through or a challenge you might be struggling through right now, but it can actually bring about the entire redemption. The Rebbe, who, as many of you know, wanted Mashiach literally to come right now and lived his life every single moment, sending out shluchim around the world, Chabad rabbis, Chabad houses, all with the one goal of trying to bring Mashiach and making it happen today. So one of the things that he encouraged us to do, and we're actually starting a class on this shortly, right after Rosh Hashanah, I believe, was for people to get educated on Mashiach. And he pointed out something very interesting, that at the beginning of any class where we teach about Mashiach, we should give tzedakah. Now, tzedakah is always a good thing, right? But he said, why? Because the Talmud tells us that tzedakah is directly connected. Giving tzedakah is directly connected with the Geula, with Mashiach himself coming. See how powerful this mitzvah is? But today, we're not really here to talk that much about the power of mitzvah. We're here to talk much more about the intent of the mitzvah of tzedakah. Mm-hmm. What do I mean? Many of the mitzvot in the Torah, and I'm sure many of you here are familiar with this, require intent. What does that mean? Intent means that I'm doing it for the right purposes. Okay, so let me paint you a picture. It's Rosh Hashanah morning, and you are the shofar, the official shofar blower for your synagogue. Okay? Now, it's been a year, so you figure you're going to take your shofar out in the morning, and you're going to practice for the whole day. Right? You know, you're going to blow maybe once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Maybe there's going to be 2 services. Maybe it's COVID times, so there's going to be 1 service indoors and 1 service outdoors. There's going to be 1 service inside a tent and 1 service outside. Maybe you're going to go to the park and blow again for people who didn't hear shofar. So you figure, let me start off the morning by practicing and making sure I got my technique down pat. So you wake up in the morning before prayers and you say to yourself, I'm going to do the entire gamut. All 30, well, really 100, but 30 kolot, which means 30 blasts that you're supposed to do with the shofar. You do the whole thing. Now you are not having in mind to do the mitzvah of shofar, but you've done everything perfectly. You're a perfect shofar blower. Let's say something happens, you can't make it to shul later. Your wife goes into labor, you have to go to the hospital, etc. Are you required to blow shofar again for yourself? Forget what the shul's going to do. They'll find somebody else, a substitute. The answer is no. The answer is no, because when you blow shofar, you have to have in mind the mitzvah of blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Kalman, you want to read this for us in text 5, which is from the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law. Go for it.
One does not fulfill their obligation regarding any of the mitzvahs unless the act was performed with the expressed intent of performing a mitzvah. Thus, a person who sounds the shofar as a casual activity for practice has not fulfilled his obligation. Similarly, a person who hears the shofar blast from someone who sounded them as a casual activity has also not fulfilled his obligation, even if he intended to do so. Inasmuch as the person sounding the shofar did not have the required intent, the sounds that were heard were invalid.
Oh, thank you, Kalman. What do you think, Kalman? The mitzvah of tzedakah should be tzrichos kavana, should need to have intent, or does not need to have intent? Now, I should point out to you, by the way, that there are many mitzvahs in the Torah that need to have intent. Tefillin needs to have intent. There's different varying degrees of which mitzvahs. Some mitzvahs, you have to redo them if you didn't have in mind properly. And other mitzvahs not. You know, eating matzah, you're supposed to eat it specifically for the sake of eating matzah. By the way, I'll give you another, like a little way that you can tell. Very often, the reason we make a blessing, we make a bracha beforehand, before a mitzvah, is in order to focus our intent on the mitzvah. Kalman, what do you think? Yes intent or no intent necessary for tzedakah?
So I'm kind of on the fence, and I kind of like cheated. I grabbed the Sefer HaChinuch, and he opens up, and he says, "La'asos tzedakah im hatzarich elaha b'simcha uvetuv levav." So he says very clearly that that's part of the mitzvah. So on the other hand, the other side of me says, well, if the whole object is so that that poor person receive that money. He has received it, not with a smile, but he has received it. But I think when it comes to tzedakah, there's the danger that if you don't give it with a smile and you give it begrudgingly, that actually negates the whole mitzvah. So that doesn't really answer your question. I would say that
like a good Jew, he answers a question with 3 more.
I don't know.
So let me reframe the question. If someone gives tzedakah without intent, or with let's not even talk with negative intent, but begrudgingly, okay? Not specifically negatively, but it's hard for him. Would you say he has to redo the mitzvah? Meaning, does that mitzvah count for whatever it's worth?
I think it does count. And we were discussing anonymity before also. You gave it to the gabbai. So
right.
It's the gabbai that gives it to the ani. So if he doesn't give it with a smile, does that negate your mitzvah of giving it?
Before I answer that question, before we keep going with this conversation, let me share a story, okay? Because this story, it's such a great story, and it's really going to help with. Not only it'll help, but it'll illustrate at least a little bit, and it'll give us perspective here. There was a man whose name was Shimon, and he was a wealthy innkeeper, and he was renowned for his generosity, and he was also a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. Now, the Alter Rebbe had him on a strict regimen where he was working on his ego. Okay, so he would come to the Alter Rebbe for private audiences, and he would work on not being so high and mighty, and that's right, etc., etc. And one time he comes to the Alter Rebbe and he says, I have a problem. Every time I give tzedakah, every time I give it, and he did so often apparently, I feel very, very good about it. And I pat myself on the back, oh, Shimon, you great man, and you're such a big tzaddik, you give tzedakah to other people. And I feel so good about it. And it really gives me an ego boost. Should I stop giving tzedakah? The Alter Rebbe responded to him. He said, I have news for you. I don't know if he said it in those words. That's me paraphrasing. He said, I have news for you. For the poor man who has food to eat on Shabbos, he doesn't feel your ego. All he feels is the food that's going into his tummy.
Right.
And therefore he said you should not stop giving tzedakah because it's all about the action. Does that give us any clarity? I mean, clearly there's still a conversation about giving begrudgingly. But what do you think of that? What do you think of that perspective, Marilyn? You're muted.
Marilyn,
we can't. She's working on it. We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Because I'm in a creaky chair and I'm moving around a lot.
That's okay. That's okay. Don't worry.
No, I think the important thing is that he gives, and then he can work on giving grudgingly for his own sake. But it's important that he helps someone else for their sake.
I love it. This is not the direction we're going to take in this class, but let me just point out that Marilyn has just connected this week's class with last week's class. Everybody remember that? When we spoke about not starting at the basics, Judaism is not an all or nothing religion. You can do something that's way above your status and then get to something that's less and just do as much as you can, whenever you can. You shouldn't ever consider yourself a hypocrite. So I love it, yes. The Alter Rebbe's answer was clearly that he should continue to give. The question is, though, about this intent. Like Kalman said, we asked a lot of questions, we gave a lot of answers, but we really didn't end up anywhere concrete just yet. So let's start with the Rambam. Maimonides actually has some very strict words for someone who gives tzedakah begrudgingly. Arnold, you want to read them for us?
Whenever a person gives charity to a person with an unpleasant countenance and with his face buried in the earth, he loses and destroys his merit, even if he gives him 1,000 gold pieces.
So he loses and destroys his merit. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave us in terms of the importance of intent when giving tzedakah? What do you guys think? Stephanie, where are you at?
I don't know the answer.
You're not sure. All right. Okay. So we move on to section 2, money in hand.
It means that the intent is part of the giving.
Okay.
Well,
all right. It's part of it, certainly. But you can't really can't separate them. But I guess the question is, how important is it?
You're cheating yourself out of your own happiness.
Right. Oh, okay. That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective.
Growth.
Okay. Before we move on, Sharon, I think you want to share something?
Just that I think that when one practices compassion and loving kindness, that it eventually will change your soul. So just it's the action of doing it and making it a part of your path in this world, that this is something you do every day.
Beautiful.
You know, it changes who you are.
Except that you can be giving it begrudgingly. You can be doing it every day. That's
Absolutely. But let me point something out, Arnold. And I'll point out, Shalom, that I loved your answer for two reasons. First of all, because it's almost a direct quote of the Chinuch. The Chinuch, which Kalman was just quoting, which is not in our text regimen for today, but the Chinuch was one of the codifiers in the mitzvot. We've quoted him on multiple occasions here in this class. And one of the things that he's unique for is for giving reasons for the mitzvot. Very often, and Kalman, maybe you can tell us if he does so by the mitzvah of tzedakah, but by many other mitzvot, the Chinuch introduces us to a rule which is called Acharei ha'pe'ulot nimshachim halavavot. That after our actions, our emotions will be led. In other words, you're not happy, start acting happy, and then you'll start being happy. And this brings us to the second reason why I love this answer, specifically coming from you, Sharon, because you're a therapist, right?
True.
Right? So I would imagine that very often, at least one of the hacks that there are for therapy in terms of treating our emotions are to do things which will then stop worrying so much about your emotions being in the right place, start doing things, then your emotions will come along with you. You'll get into the mood of it, right?
That's, yeah. It's like it's setting an intention, right?
Right. Kavanah is exactly what we're discussing here. So definitely the actions can start to draw the intentions after them. And by the way, and this will address Arnold's point, which was he was saying you can be giving it over and over begrudgingly. Tzedakah is literally one of the only mitzvot that I know of which we're told do it and do it as often as possible. Which means if you have an option of giving $100 to someone or giving $100, $1 at a time, there's actually a certain benefit. Okay, leaving aside for a moment whether the person may need the full $100 now, so then you certainly do give them then. But let's say you're giving to an institution, for instance, and they just need the $100 by the end of the month. Giving $1 a day or $3 a day, whatever it is that will equal $100 at the end of the month, is actually considered a greater merit. Why? Because the more you do that action, the more you become a giving person. This is only found by the mitzvah of tzedakah. For another perspective on this, the Rebbe encouraged people to have at least one pushka. Well, in general, to have a pushka, which means a charity box in their home, but also to have at least one charity box affixed to the wall, and specifically in the kitchen. What's going on here? The Rebbe pointed out that when you do that, whether it's with a double-sided piece of tape or whether it's with a nail, you're actually connecting it to the wall, and therefore you're making not just yourself a giving self, but you're making a home a giving a home. Why specifically the kitchen? The Rebbe said because when you make food for yourself, you will be much more inclined, because that's how we work as human beings, right? Empathy and sympathy for other people. So when you're making food for yourself, you realize you need food, you're much more likely to say, okay, I'm also going to give to someone else who might be in need. How powerful is that about the mitzvah of tzedakah? So certainly the actions that we do affect that. But let's try to figure out, so where do we land with this intent? Okay? If you have to give tzedakah, is it okay if it's given with the wrong intentions, or does it must be given with the right intention? So for this, we turn to another mitzvah, not in this week's Torah portion, but in a couple weeks from now. We're going to read about something else. We're going to read about somebody who does a mitzvah of tzedakah by mistake. Okay? So remember I told you how there's lots of mitzvot in the Torah which are part of this general term tzedakah? Here's another one of them. Kalman, you want to read it for us? Text 7.
When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to take it. It shall be left for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. Thank
you, Kalman. This is the mitzvah called shikha. Shikha means that if you forget something in the field, you should leave it for the poor. You shouldn't go back to get something that you left behind. All right? Now, this is a very interesting mitzvah. Why? Because we're talking about somebody that forgot something. And very often he won't even know that he forgot it, and someone else will be benefiting from it. So this starts to talk about someone who's giving tzedakah and he's not even aware that he's giving tzedakah. So Sherilyn, in text 8, the Sifri, which is a medrash, expounds on this idea. You want to read for us?
Yeah, although we might get interrupted in a moment.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Rabbi Elazar
yes.
ben Azariah said, how do we know that if someone loses a selah coin,
yes,
selah coin from his hand, and it is found by a pauper who then benefits from it, the Torah credits him with this mitzvah? It is for this reason the verse states, for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. Now, if one can earn merit even without intending to do so, and the Torah considers it a worthy act, how much more so when one intends to do something worthy and carries it out?
Okay, so says the Sifri, if someone, so they're just learning from here that you can do a mitzvah without even knowing. Thank you, Sherilyn, for sharing this with us. And says the Sifri, let's take that as a perspective for when we actually do have intent to help someone else. How much more powerful is that mitzvah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody with me here?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, some of you, I mentioned briefly earlier, some of you may have caught it, that there is this concept, the concept of making a bracha on a mitzvah. Okay, what do we mean by that? This above story with this person who gave tzedakah, but didn't mean to give tzedakah, so it starts to bring up this idea that you might not even be aware of doing the mitzvah. Okay, now, many mitzvot have a blessing, a bracha that we make before we do the mitzvah. Okay, so for instance, before we put on tefillin, we make a blessing before we put on tefillin. All the men here will be familiar with that. Before we light Shabbat candles, women, you make a bracha and then you light the Shabbat candles, right? What is going on here? So let's dive a little bit into the laws of making a bracha. Whenever you make a bracha, you're actually supposed to have the object which you're making the bracha on immediately on hand. So much so that, for instance, one of the more common brachas that we make, which is when we drink or eat, you're actually supposed to be holding the glass of water or the piece of chip or whatever it is in your hand when you're making the blessing. Do you know why? Because we're worried you may make a blessing on this chip and it's sitting right here in front of you on the table, but by the time you get to eating it, it might not be there anymore because something might have happened. Whereas if you're holding it in your hand, then you won't forget and it'll be directly connected to the action that you do, right? So as a result, there are few mitzvot that don't have a bracha, and one of them is tzedakah. Do you know why these mitzvot don't have a bracha? In text 9, the Rashba explains. Where are we holding here? Brett, you want to read for us? Text 9.
Okay. We do not recite a blessing on a mitzvah whose fulfillment is beyond one's own control. For if the fulfillment of the mitzvah is dependent on another person, it is possible that the person will not be satisfied, thereby rendering the action void. For example, the mitzvah of giving to the poor, or lending to the needy, or giving charity, or bequeathing, severance pay to a freed slave, and so on.
So says the Rashba, thank you, says the Rashba that we have a problem with the mitzvah of tzedakah, which is the entire mitzvah is not in your control. Just like we said that if the chip is not in your hand, you cannot make a bracha on it because it might disappear. You might give the charity, but then the receiver might not receive it for whatever reason. Maybe because, I don't know, he decides he's not interested in it. Maybe he becomes too embarrassed to take it from you. So it's not all in your hands because the mitzvah of tzedakah is about giving and the receiver receiving. So whereas it's not common a scenario for someone for someone to give tzedakah, but that it's not received, but because it's out of his hands, there's no way that he can possibly make a bracha on it because it's not up to him to do the action that comes afterwards. These last couple texts, this kind of perspective on the bracha and the idea that you can do the mitzvah sometimes without even knowing it, they seem to imply that intent is not exactly everything that's going on here. It's more about the actual giving, not about the intent. Okay? And we seem to have that from the Rambam as well, from Maimonides as well earlier, right? Maimonides said that if you give it and you give it begrudgingly or you give it with a sour face, then what was the line he used? Let's try to be medayek. Let's try to be careful of the words of the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Besever panim rois." If you give it with an unpleasant countenance and with his face buried in the earth, that's an exact quote from the Rambam. Then you lose out on all the credit there is for a mitzvah. So it would seem that you do need to have the right intent. When you're giving the tzedakah, you have to be in it for the right reason to help someone else. Mm-hmm. Okay? So we've done enough on that side of things. Let's jump to the other perspective. Okay? From the other side, we have, guess who? The same Rambam. There is a famous section of the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. This is text 10. Hold on, let me bring it up. I was supposed to have this up while we were having this conversation. Sakaman, if you can read for us, this is a very famous part of the Rambam. In his laws on tzedakah, he brings up for us 8 different levels of giving tzedakah. Go for it.
There are 8 levels in charity, each level surpassing the other. The highest level beyond which there is none is a person who supports a Jew who has fallen into poverty by giving him a present or a loan, entering into a partnership with him, or finding him work so that his hand will be fortified, so that he will not have to ask others for alms. Concerning this, the verse states, "You shall support him, the stranger, the resident, and he shall live among you." Implied is that you should support him before he falls and becomes needy. A lower level than this is one who gives charity to the poor without knowing to whom he gave and without the poor person knowing from whom he received. A lower level
than that.
Yes? You with us, Kalman?
Yeah, sorry. A lower level than that is an instance when the giver knows to whom he is giving, but the poor person does not know from whom he received. A lower level than that is an instance when the poor person knows from whom he took, but the donor does not know to whom he gave. A lower level than that is giving the poor person in his hand before he asks. A lower level than that is giving him after he asks. And a lower level than that is giving him less than what is appropriate, but with a pleasant countenance. A lower level than that is giving him with sadness.
In other words, you're sad that you're giving your own money away. So, of course, this goes all the way from the highest level, which is teach a man to fish, right,
Mm-hmm.
which is the most respectful way to give, all the way down to giving it to him, and you really feel bad about the fact that you're parting with your own money, etc., which is obviously a very low level of giving. But clearly, if we follow the progression here, the Rambam is putting a lot of emphasis on intent, on kavanah, on what exactly you're thinking as you're giving the tzedakah, right? And what the effect is on you in terms of the way you feel about it and the way you think about it, etc. Meaning sometimes knowing the person or the person knowing you has a lot to do with how you feel about it. So clearly there is a lot of emphasis on this. So the Rambam himself seems to be contradicting himself, because later on in the Rambam, he says, hey, if you give it, but you give it, with your face buried in the ground with an unpleasant countenance, so then it takes away from your tzedakah. So that seems to be a little bit of a contradiction. And to this comes a little bit later in time, the Rashba, and the Shach, of course. Yeah, the Rashba precedes the Rambam. The Shach, who is one of the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, and he said on the Jewish Code of Law, and he tries to explain the discrepancy in the words of the Rambam. Arnold, you want to read for us?
Giving with sadness, while he may be upset about giving at the very least, he doesn't display a frown. If he does, it is not considered one of the 8 levels, since he has lost his merit altogether, and he transgresses the prohibition of giving with aggrievement.
I think so, yeah.
I'm not familiar with that word.
Aggrievement, whatever. I guess giving it with a bad face, or remember this idea of lo yera lebavcha, giving it with an unpleasant countenance.
Grieving that you're doing it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I guess that's the idea of aggrievement.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this kind of answers the contradiction, the outright contradiction of the Rambam, because he says, okay, the Maimonides says there's a difference. You could be feeling sad, but not showing that you're feeling sad. So in one of them, when you're showing that you're feeling sad, you're taking away from your mitzvah of tzedakah. But if you're not showing it, but you're still feeling it, then it's considered giving tzedakah, but it's the lowest level of giving tzedakah.
Mm-hmm.
So this definitely answers the contradiction, but it kind of still confuses us when it comes to this matter of intent, and how much does intent matter when it comes to giving tzedakah. And really, what is the point of all this intent? In other words, if the idea here, remember that story with the Alter Rebbe, where he said the person who has the food for Shabbos doesn't care that your ego was boosted by it. So if the point of tzedakah is to help other people, right? Certainly we shouldn't show that we're feeling bad about it. But if we feel bad about it, why is it considered a lower level of tzedakah? The Rambam lists like these 8 levels. What is he getting at here, right? What is he trying to get to? How could there be a wrong display of demeanor when giving tzedakah if the end result is what matters. The person got the tzedakah. What is the difference? How I feel about it. Okay? So for this, yeah, go ahead.
Would it be that the giving is not only for the person who is receiving, but also for the person that is giving, for oneself?
That is a very valid point. And there's definitely something about giving tzedakah that's about the person that's giving. And that's going to be part of what we're talking about here. Yes, that will be a portion of the answer. Thank you, Arnold. So to summarize, where are we? We've arrived at a position where it turns out that giving tzedakah is not just about the what, not just about what you give, it's also about how you give it. The how is just as important, okay? Remember that question where we said giving tzedakah is best when it is given with? I think that all the answers are correct. Love, when it's given with love, when it's given with a smile, when it's given with anonymity. But I really think that there's something very, very powerful about that word dignity. That word dignity. There's something about, and I really hope that nobody on this Zoom has ever been in this situation, but there's something about a person who's in a position where they're down on their luck and they need someone else, they need to rely on someone else in order to make it through this month or whatever it is. There's something extremely, extremely degrading about it. So much so that many people won't even ask for tzedakah, and they really need to seek them out and give it to them, etc. And if you look through the 8 levels of the Rambam, and we'll do so in just a moment, you'll notice a very clear progression, which is that as the Rambam goes through his 8 levels, I'll pull them up here again in just a moment, he really talks about the different levels of dignity. Because someone who's down on their luck is already losing their dignity. How can we avoid them losing even more dignity?
Mm-hmm.
Because dignity is a very, very important part of the way we were created. In fact, in text 12, which is from Birkat HaMazon, the benching that we do, right, the grace of two meals that we do after we eat bread, we actually, one of the things that we ask God for is that we should never lose our dignity. Stephanie, you want to read this for us?
Yes. He says, ends us, nourish us, sustain us, feed us, and provide us with plenty and speedily. Lord our God, grant us relief from all of our afflictions. Lord our God, please do not make us dependent upon the gifts of mortal men, nor upon their loans, but only upon their full, open, holy, and generous hand, that we may never be shamed or disgraced.
Thank you, Stephanie. Now let me just clarify something. Let me just clarify that all those that come to the Monday class will know a lot about this from me, right? Everything that we get in this world comes from Hashem. Even if we do have to rely on someone else, it's clearly still from Hashem. Even if we are going to our business and we're earning our own money, it still comes from Hashem. The request here is, if it's going to come from you, Hashem, we want to be reliant just on you. That I could handle. I don't want to need to rely that it should come from you through somebody else, because that involves what were the words? That involves shame and disgrace, and we don't want that. We don't want a loss of dignity as we give tzedakah. And to this says the Rambam: if somebody gives tzedakah, and he gives it in a way that he's making the person lose their dignity, he's taking away even more from the person's dignity. For instance, the person gives it and his head is buried in the ground, and he kind of says, I got to give this tzedakah, so I'm giving it, but I don't really want to give it to you. What he is doing, says the Rambam, is he giving tzedakah? The fact is he's physically giving tzedakah. But as he's giving that tzedakah, which is inherently restoring to a person a certain amount of dignity, you're giving him money, which is also going to help him be on his feet. At the very same time that you're giving him that dignity, you're also taking away from his dignity. By giving it to him in a certain way, you're also taking away from his dignity. So think for a moment, if let's say we were able to somehow quantify dignity into dollars, convert dignity into some form of a currency of dollars. And let's say that by you giving tzedakah with a negative attitude, and you're showing the other person that it's coming with a negative attitude, maybe you're making them lose $200 worth of dignity. If you are giving them $100 worth of tzedakah, you've actually detracted from their lives and not added. And that's such a perspective to keep in mind as we give tzedakah. Now, you can have a negative attitude towards it and hide it and not show it. It's still not the greatest form of tzedakah, because tzedakah is all about recognizing, becoming empathetic to the other person and increasing their dignity. But it will at the very least be the lowest level of tzedakah, because you're not taking away from their dignity and you're adding a little bit because you're giving them actual tzedakah. And this is the power of a frown versus the power of a smile. Because we know that anything, if you can do it in the negative, then you can do it in the positive much more powerfully. Marilyn, you want to read for us text 13? The Rebbe reminds us that if we can choose to do it, you have to unmute yourself, Marilyn. If we can choose to do it in a positive way, give it specifically with a smile, and learn to be empathetic towards the other as we give, then we're doing much more than giving, we're also restoring dignity. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, one does not cast their eyes away from tzedakah. That is, they give it proper attention, empathizing with the poor person. Then even if that moment one does not actually give charity for whatever reason, nevertheless, there's a strong chance that ultimately he will give because he is in this state.
Thank you. And the Rambam himself, Sherilyn, you want to read for us? The Rambam himself reminds us of this. He says in text 14 that yes, when you give with, meaning this is a continuation to the previous text about giving with a lack of, meaning with your head buried in the ground and an unpleasant countenance, so then you're detracting from the mitzvah. He says instead, go ahead.
Instead, he should give to him with a pleasant countenance and with happiness, commiserating with him about his troubles. As the verse states, did I not weep for those who face difficult times? Did not my soul feel sorrow for the destitute? And he should speak to him words of sympathy and comfort. As the verse states, I would bring joy to a widow's heart.
Thank you. So when we give tzedakah, it's important for us to remember that it's not just a physical act. This person is missing $100 in their monthly budget, and I can give them this $100 or this dollar or this dime. But it's also about a very powerful emotional thing that's going on here. Human beings are emotional people. We are by nature, we were created as socially emotional and psychological creatures who have all this other stuff going on at the same time. And so when we choose to focus on that and to put ourselves in the shoes of the person that we're giving to, and to find a way to empathize with them, and to not only give them and not make them feel bad, but to make them feel good about the fact that we're giving them, then we really, really pick things up to a very, very powerful level. We're giving them much more than just money. We're giving them much more than just food or clothing. We're giving them dignity. That's a very powerful thing that we can give. And probably my favorite text from tonight's class is the next one, which is the Rebbe, Ron, and if you could read this for us, please. The Rebbe shares with us that actually this doesn't just go to poor people. Think about it. The gift of dignity is something that we can give even without giving money. We can sometimes give the gift of dignity to other people, even if they're much richer than us. How does that work? Ron, when you're ready.
Obviously, even when one encounters a fellow Jew who lacks nothing, materially or spiritually, it is possible to perform charity by greeting him with a smile, or even an actual deed by inviting him to be your guest, to offer him something to eat, drink, or a place to stay. In fact, as the Jewish people were preparing to receive the Torah after leaving Egypt, this was the form their charity took. After leaving Egypt, every Jew had whatever they needed. More than that, they were wealthy, as the rabbinic literature relates, with regard to the tremendous amount of gold and silver the Jewish people took as spoils from Egypt, and especially from after the splitting of the sea. Undoubtedly, by the time the Jews received the Torah, it was not possible for anyone, even if they had wanted to have squandered all that wealth in such a short time. Which begs the question, how did they observe the mitzvah of giving charity when not a single one of them needed anything? We are compelled to say that they fulfilled the mitzvah of charity, not by giving money, but by showing each other a pleasant demeanor.
Thank you, Ron. How interesting a perspective is that? For 40 years after the Jewish people, I'm definitely expanding on this a little bit, but For 40 years after the Jewish people left Egypt, after the giving of the Torah, to before they went into the land of Israel, they really didn't lack for anything. They had manna from heaven. I mean, they had all the spoils from war, so they were really even all rich. All right, could be some people lost some of it along the way in the desert, whatever. So you ended up with some poor people. But really, the most powerful way of them giving tzedakah in those times was actually not giving money. It was giving the gift of dignity. The title of today's lesson. I don't always agree with the titles they put, but this week is a very good title, the gift of dignity. We can give that to people, whether they're in the same financial status as us, lower than us, or above us, doesn't make a difference. Whether we're giving tzedakah, whether we're not giving tzedakah, giving dignity is always a powerful thing that we can always do, and that we should always practice. And that's something, we can lift somebody else's spirit, we can make somebody else feel better about themselves. And that really does fall into the mitzvah of tzedakah. Brett, what do you say?
I just want to say, out of this whole class, no one has mentioned
Okay.
the idea that wealthy people seem to never have extra money. All their money is accounted for. And then there's people like me who have like all these hundreds of dollars every month, just extra, like, here you go. I'm giving everyone on the street money.
Absolutely. You are a perfect example of someone, who their giving is not dependent on how much they have. It's much more about the attitude with which they're giving, and that restores dignity to other people, and it helps other people feel good about themselves and feel whole about themselves. It's up to us to make the people around us feel whole about themselves. And perhaps one of the reasons why you're so happy about it, Fischl, is because of the next and last point that we're going to make tonight, which is, believe it or not, when we give tzedakah, one of the reasons why we're told to smile about it, that's why I loved when so many people on Facebook responded that the best way to give tzedakah is to give it with a smile. When we give tzedakah, we give it with a smile, we're actually showing appreciation. Believe it or not. Not the person who's receiving the tzedakah, the person giving the tzedakah. The person giving the tzedakah has something very, very important to be appreciative of. And this is text 16. What are we holding here? I think Arnold. Go ahead.
More than the benefactor does for the beggar does for the benefactor.
Says the Medrash, stop being so high and mighty. I'm the giver, you're the taker. Very often, in the transaction of tzedakah, where one person is giving another person, the true person benefiting here is the person giving. Boom.
Yeah.
What's going on here? So for the last text of tonight, Marilyn, you want to bring this home for us, please?
Sure.
The Rabbi explains.
This is one way to explain why one should give charity with a pleasant countenance. After all, since extending support to the poor person and his family, of what import is pleasant countenance? Certainly displaying a frown while giving charity is to be condemned, since quite obviously it can cause embarrassment and so on. But what imperative is there to give with a smile? The explanation is that giving charity with a smile is a way to show solidarity and to emphasize that the giver realizes that he is also receiving something from the poor person. Since, if not for the recipient, he would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of charity.
Thank you, Marilyn. When we give tzedakah, if we can learn to have this perspective, my friends, we will be in a much better place. To have the perspective that when we give tzedakah to someone else, we are not so much giving and we are the high person and they are the low person and they're receiving and we're giving, but rather this is a unique opportunity that this person is giving to us. Why is he poor? That's not our calculation, but we know that it has a lot to do with Hashem. And it's not because of his sins, and it's certainly not for us to judge him for his sins. It's had nothing to do with that. What's going on here is Hashem is saying, I am putting this person in front of you, which gives you an opportunity to give him. Become my partner, says Hashem. To give tzedakah, to give to someone in need, to give to a cause, to give whatever it is to become partners with the Almighty. Tell me one other time that you have such an opportunity to do so. So the next time you're presented with a situation of tzedakah, whatever it is, somebody knocks on your door and says, I need X amount, and you give it to him. And yes, it's hard for you to give it. But that hard for you to give it should be like how hard it is to own a house, to buy a house. You know, like when we buy a house also, we put down a lot of money, and it's very hard to give up that money, right? But we're like so happy because we got to be homeowners, and we get to purchase it, and we're so happy we're getting something out of the fact that we're giving the money. When we give tzedakah, we get much more than a house, much more than a car, much more than purchasing anything. We get the gift of becoming partners with Hashem in this world and what's going on in this world. And that, my friends, should make us so joyful, so radiant, that our countenance, that the way we display to the other person is not just empathetic, but it's thankful. It's like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to give you something, to give something back to Hashem, to become partners with Him, etc. And that is why tzedakah is such a powerful mitzvah. So, does that take away from the fact that tzedakah is very much about the act and the giving of the money, and the person needs the money, and the person needs whatever it is that they're receiving? Yeah, of course it doesn't take away from that. But on the other hand, we have to understand that the more we can get in tune with this attitude, 8 levels in fact, the more we become partners with Hashem, and the more we're having the true perspective of being happy with this opportunity, happy with this mitzvah, and happy with being able to be partners with Hashem. So l'chaim, l'chaim. Let's finish off our wine from Wine and Wisdom for this evening. L'chaim to partnering with Hashem over and over again. May Hashem give you all, you should all be able to partner very often with Him. That we should be able to do so not just happily, not begrudgingly, but smiling and joyful and dancing at the opportunity that we're presented with to be able to give tzedakah. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Amen.
This is for bread as well.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for inviting.
You got it.
Thank you, Rabbi.